Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining. We'll get started in a minute or so. We're just going to wait for some more people to join the session. In the meantime, I'm just going to pop some housekeeping information into the chat box on how to how to participate today. But yeah, we'll just give it another minute. In the meantime, also, it'd be wonderful if you could let me know in the chat whereabouts you're currently dialing in from. I am in Melbourne, Australia, and it is a bit of an overcast day here, unfortunately. But yeah, let me know where you are. It's always super interesting to see where we get everyone from. Welcome, Craig. Craig from Singapore, welcome. Thanks so much for joining. Tim from Sydney, welcome. Leo from New York City, welcome. Alrighty, I might get started. Hi everyone, I'm Kate from General Assembly. Welcome to today's event, Big Tech, Big Problems or Big Opportunities for Business. Thanks for joining us. Before we commence our event, myself and General Assembly Australia would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands, where we live, learn, work and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today's event is part of the much loved, well-loved event series, the 2030 Movement, which is a two-week-long online festival for the next leaders, thinkers, innovators in tech. I'd also like to do a huge thank you to our panelists and moderators today. We've got Yusarn, Chiew, Sunita, Bose, and Leesa, Soulodre. Thanks so much for jumping on board today, and we look forward to hearing all your insights. Before we get going, I also want to say a huge thank you to all our partners and speakers who have collaborated with us today for the 2030 movement. Without all your hard work and time, as we wouldn't have been able to do it without you. So you can head to our website if you want to see more about that. I'll just run through some housekeeping info on how to participate today. If you have any questions for the panelists today, please ask those in the Q&A box and they'll get to as many of those as they can at the end of the session. If you have any general comments or any GA related inquiries, pop those in the chat box and I can follow up with you if necessary. Also, a recording of today's session will be emailed out to you within the next week. We have a lot on for the 2030 movement, so make sure you head to our website to RSVP. Later today, we have Are You Building a Brand or a Bland? And then tomorrow, we got our physical workspace is still vital in a post-COVID world. And then following that, we have What Tech Are Investors Betting On Now? So make sure you jump to our website to reserve your spot for all these sessions. And also if you want to take your learning to one step further, join our remote short workshops. You can take 50% off all our paid workshops with the code FUTUREISBRIGHT. And once again, thanks so much for joining us. If you have any inquiries, please don't hesitate to email us. It'd be wonderful as well if everyone after the session could fill out the feedback form. But yeah, enjoy the session and thanks for joining.
Good morning, good evening and good afternoon. It's my great privilege to be here with you today at General Assembly. My name is Leesa Soulodre. I'm the General Partner of R3I Ventures and I'm joined by my esteemed panelists Sunita and Yusarn. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning,
I'm really excited
Sunita.
to be here with you all. Morning, or afternoon in Sydney, rather.
I just saw everybody is dialing in from all over the world, so it's really fantastic to have such an international audience. I think the challenge of big tech is a concern and a question for everybody as we look through the pandemic for a world of opportunity. And I'm going to open up the floor to you both. How do you see this digital opportunity?
Yusarn, should I start?
Please go ahead, Sunita.
Happy to come in. Well, hi everyone. Thanks again, General Assembly, for the opportunity. I also want to start by acknowledging the owners of the traditional lands in which we meet. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. So this is a really interesting and important question, and one that I think about a lot. I run an industry association here in Australia, so a lot of my focus in this conversation will really be on Australia. And in Australia, we've got this policy goal of we want Australia to be a leading digitally enabled economy by 2030, and so we have this policy goal, and I guess now we have 9 years left. The time is ticking for us to realise that. So it's quite a big goal, and I guess how we get there is really important, and it touches upon some of these questions around sort of the interaction with big technology companies and startups, etc. I think Leesa, you touched upon the pandemic, and it's a really good point. When I think about the digital opportunity, I don't just think about how we grow one sector. I actually think about how the growth of that sector fuels every other sector in the economy. And I think that's a realization that's increasingly apparent to everybody. Noting that everybody's coming in from different parts of the world, but I think it's fair to say that everybody has been touched in some way by this pandemic. And at least what we've seen in Australia is that being a privileged country with relatively high levels of digital adoption, the digital economy has enabled a level of business continuity across a wide range of sectors that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. There's some heartbreaking stories of businesses closing, but I think what the digital technologies have done is, I guess, stopped that from grinding to a complete halt. And I suppose this anecdotal experience of what we're all experiencing right now is very much backed up in the data. So the organisation that I run, DIGI, did a study of Australia's position globally and also the impact of the sector in this country. And so what we found, this research was done in 2019. So we found that the tech sector contributes $122 billion a year to the Australian economy. But what was really interesting was that 53 billion of that actually is its impact on other sectors. So again, the opportunity is economy wide. So one of the other things that we found though is that Australia, when you compare it to other OECD peers, actually has the second smallest tech sector in the OECD, second only to Mexico, which I think we could be doing a lot better given the high rates of technology adoption here, the highly educated population. And so one of the things I think about a lot is if we look at other OECD peers and how their sector has grown, if Australia matched that growth rate, well, we could be actually, that data that we looked at actually showed that by 2030, we could be doubling that economic impact and supercharging all of these industries economy-wide. So I think the promise is there. To bring the question, I guess, back to big tech and where that sits in here, Australia is a market where we don't, compared to other markets, the presence of big technology companies is relatively small. I used to live in San Francisco, so I suppose I keep that as my benchmark. But I think we need to look really closely in a country like ours, where you're trying to grow this sector, around what the interplay is between big technology companies and sort of scale ups and startups. And I think there are certainly challenges, and I'm looking forward to diving into sort of how we manage those challenges today. But I think to start on this optimistic note about the opportunity, I think there's kind of 4 real intersections around big technology companies and the rest of the economy. First, obviously, they hire people, but secondly, their networks, contribute to employment. So there was this recent economic study of YouTube in Australia that found that all the people that actually work on creating on their YouTube channels within these companies, that's about 16,000 full-time equivalent jobs in Australia. So that's kind of, I guess, something that's not always counted in the way that we look at these sorts of jobs figures. The networks create an ease of trade, and then over time, these high-skilled employees from these large technology companies go on to start others. So, in Australia, one of the big technology success stories is Canva, and one of the 3 co-founders is an actual ex-Google engineer. And so that's the kind of ecosystem you see in a place like San Francisco, and that I experienced when I lived there. And I think that's the kind of ecosystem we need to look at how we create in a country like Australia. So yeah, look, a lot to unpack there, but I think at a high level, that's sort of where I see the opportunity, and where I see the opportunity in terms of big tech and the ecosystem that we create.
Thanks, Sunita. So I took a few highlights out of that. One was the interplay of one industry and its impact upon another in the digital economy. 2 was the opportunity to upskill and develop talent. And 3 is the opportunity to double, or in fact, in some cases in Southeast Asia, more than triple our economic impact through technology implementation. Over to you, Yusarn. You live on the bleeding edge of technology with me. Southeast Asia is a booming digital economy. We are heavily constrained at this moment in this great age of immobility, and we are living in a friction-free economy. Tell us where you see the opportunity.
Yes, I think every time you see a crisis, there's always another side to it. There's the need to adapt and to survive. And that's actually given a lot of opportunity for the companies, particularly startups in the tech space and the digital space, especially, to pivot and to really come into their own. I think what we are doing, I think it's almost a cliche now, but what we're doing is really the byproduct of that. That you see these very rich content coming through online, and all of us are probably receiving all this information and also contributing from our homes. So I think just from seeing this in action, we can see that some of we are leveraging that technology. And I think as we go forward, the lessons we've learned are not going to go away. I think the way that we do business has changed permanently. And I think even when the economies open up again, society opens up again, it's not going to go back to the old way of doing things. And I think that's basically that gives us I think a new kind of start to developing different technologies and opportunities on top of that.
And you spend your whole day looking at the risk side, so it's great that you still have that capacity to see the opportunity. They say Sergei Netazin, a famous professor from INSEAD, says there are 2 levers for disruption in a friction-free economy. One is change the level of information asymmetry in the value chain. Change who makes the decision, when it's made, where it's made, why it's made, and how it's made. And second, realign incentives. Looking out across the Asia Pacific, where do you see that has happened the greatest, where we've literally got rid of the middlemen through the transformation of our industry supply chains?
So I'm going to unleash my negative side.
Please do.
Yeah.
It's called pessimistic, isn't it? Not negative.
Well, I want to highlight the challenges so that we can come up with better solutions. And I think the promise of the internet from the early days in the early 2000s, I don't think that I think much of it has developed beyond our wildest dreams, but the sort of democratization, I think that's actually gone away a bit. I think there's been a lot of consolidation, and there's a lot of sort of concentration of power over the internet and over the access to information and leveraging of information. And that has led to a lot of concerns, actually, that these few, I think, giants in the field are really getting so much market power that it's going to be it's getting more and more difficult for smaller companies to actually spring up and thrive. So I think there is a negative side to it. And I think that these are coming out and we need to deal with them, but in a way that doesn't paralyze technological advance and to sort of throw away some of the advantages that we have. It's just that we've got to put, I think, some of the power back to the consumers. And I think that more open systems and more open markets, I think, for new ideas need to evolve as well.
And you live on the bleeding edge, I guess, around the regulatory architecture of that, Sunita. tell me, from your perspective, what is the role of big technology in realizing these opportunities? And what should be the ideal role for big companies to play in this digital economy?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. Let me try and think about. I was actually going to pick up on something that Yusarn said around the democratization, because I think that's a really interesting thing. You know, when we think back to what the promise of the internet is, I think it really, and I as a technology optimist think about this a lot, right? How technology has an amazing, we talked about the enabling power, but I think the other piece of that is that democratization. And I suppose my optimism comes because, well, I had a whole career in advocacy, but the start of my technology career, I suppose, is at the petition platform change.org. So for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a user-generated content platform where anybody can start a petition on any issue that they care about. And so what you typically find is that people have been failed by institutions, by corporations or by governments, and they start a petition, and it's their sort of last resort and hope for how they can change and change the world around them. So I just want to I think that there's a lot of challenges that technology sort of poses in relation to this democratization, but I think it's important to always ground it in the promise. So I suppose, where to go from there, I guess, so I think we need to have our eyes on how we manage sort of some of the challenges, not just around sort of democracy. I think we can talk about that, around online safety, around privacy. I think the other piece that we need to remember is that none of these problems are new. And so I think there's sometimes, I guess, when we think about the policy solutions, there's often a tendency, I find, I suppose, in running an industry association, there's a focus on, okay, well, how do we get the top technology to fix these problems? But often the problems run a lot deeper than that. I guess, again, there's so much to this question. I think putting that aside, the part about, what's the role of, that Yusarn mentioned around how we write the rules, I think this is a really interesting question as well, because what I find is that there is a lot of regulation being put forward kind of around how we address some of those challenges I identified that are typically associated with kind of quote unquote big tech, large technology companies. But what typically happens also, and I've experienced this actually working from a smaller technology company. When I was at Change.org, it was my job to create safety and privacy policies, is that, often, and compliance, and often those rules are kind of written with the largest technology companies in mind, but we don't often think about how the smaller companies operate them. So there's a lot there. Maybe we can dive into some of that a little bit more later on, but that's just a high level of some of the things I think about associated with these issues.
It's really interesting. I must say I have been the beneficiary of your petition platform in building a fence around my children's park in my condo in Singapore. And if it wasn't for your platform, I don't think my little fence around my children's park would have ever been built. So thank you so much. But on the other side, I've also been a pioneer in Singapore, taking deep neural network technologies embedded on the edge out of the lab for public safety and security, and seen them exported into countries that have used that exact same technology for oppression and have then exported it to 40 other countries around the world for oppression. So I have lived, I guess, the Black Mirror side of technology. And I want to pose to you, Yusarn, when I was designing those technologies, I couldn't put in a kill switch. It was a tool. I had no idea how people were truly going to use my technology. I knew for what function, but I didn't know for what purpose. That same technology could be used for mass weapon swarms that could kill with artificial intelligence hundreds of thousands of people. What is it that we can be doing in the regulatory context to put better controls around the technologies that we're building and to put them into the hands of the consumer in a way that there is safeguards? Or am I just the optimist and believe that that can be done when it can't?
Well, this is not a new problem. The Greeks had their myth of the Pandora's box. And that's what we live with. We innovate. We come up with better ways of doing certain things. And these tools are used for good and also for evil. Mm-hmm. I think it's futile to try and regulate technology. I mean, I'm a lawyer, but I can tell you as a lawyer that the law is outdated well, I wouldn't say law itself is outdated, but laws become outdated very quickly. But they're also a blunt instrument. And it's really difficult to regulate technology when new technology comes out all the time. But I believe that it is possible to regulate human behavior. And that is what the laws do, right? I always say that the laws are code for humans. But unlike machines that obey code literally, and sometimes creating errors as a result, humans find all kinds of ways to, interpret the rules in their own favor. And so, yes, you can regulate, and you can regulate, and there are examples of that. I think in Singapore, as you might know, although we are one of the sort of the most open to new ideas and new technologies, we also have a lot of strict rules.
Yes.
And you can see the responses, I think, to various aspects, negative aspects of, the digitalization, especially social media, in two pieces of legislation. One is the Protection Against Harassment Act, and that it covers online harassment. So that we set around rules around things like doxing and things like, certain types of online behavior that threaten people, right? So that's on the private individual side. And on the other hand, we also have this very controversial fake news laws, the prevention or the protection against falsehoods and misinformation, basically, in Singapore. And that is directed to protect, I think, against, public opinion kind of being formed around false statements of fact that are against the public interest. So I think it's an attempt to try and hold people responsible for what they do, in a way that and I think it still remains to be seen how effective it is. But I think in some countries like Singapore, we're not afraid to experiment with regulation. But it's got to be around rules. And as for weaponization, I think much of it depends on the I guess the international community of countries, and making sure that everybody plays by the same rules. And I think it is incumbent on the people who see themselves as, I think, the custodians of the international order, so to speak, to also themselves behave in a way that's consistent with the principles that we all like to see the powerful countries espouse.
I'd like to ask you a question, Yusarn. If you are living on a friction-free platform, what legislation applies to which country's jurisdiction? And I use a simple example of our colleague's satirical Twitter handle that in the UK and Australia would get millions of followers, and people would be laughing because the person was taking the mickey out of some rubbish they heard on the train in the morning. Whereas in Singapore, the gentleman was jailed for 2 weeks, lost his job, and pretty much lost everything. Versus the challenge of something like fake news, or in the case of complete misinformation with deep fakes. I remember when I moved to Singapore in 2013, I took a challenge to our Advanced Digital Science Centre. If you remember, there was that example of somebody peeing on a pizza at Pizza Hut that had gone viral on YouTube. And the question was, could we use technology to detect that type of stuff and pick it up really quickly as the brand owner? I mean, where is the regulatory foundation of these types of limits? Is it at a national level as to where the platform resides? Or is it where the crime was perpetrated, on what IP address? How does that work? Can you talk us through it?
Yes, I think I'm not quite familiar with those videos you mentioned. Maybe because my browsing habits are a little bit different.
I imagine.
Yes, well, Okay, so but when we look at regulation, it always is jurisdictional. It has to be primarily national, right? There are international rules, but these are also applied via national laws, right? And that means that the nexus is the country, the state, yeah. But you can also see a lot of extraterritoriality to laws, right? Which we see nowadays quite a lot actually. And the question is again, where does it point itself to? And the answer, it really is, it depends on the court that's applying that law, right? And also the intention of the legislation. You can have very powerful extraterritorial laws, but unless you have a means to enforce those laws, right? It's really just it's just a piece of paper, right? It doesn't have any teeth. What I think would be the most applicable, obviously, is if it is within the borders of that country where they enact those laws. I think laws need to be different as well. I mean, you mentioned the friction-free internet, and the idea that the internet is somehow a free-for-all, and there is people are essentially free to do whatever they want to do, simply because it just occurs on in the internet somewhere. And that's not true. I think everyone who lives in a society needs to abide by the rules of that society, set by that particular society. You might have different opinions about it. You might say, well, the people didn't really have a choice. These rules are applied in a way that's unfair, and these people are therefore living under oppression. But the people living in those countries might understand it somewhat differently. They might not enjoy being regulated in that way, but they may see it as a particular trade-off for being able to have the other things that are also nice in life, which is
Yes.
orderly, harmonious society to live in. I think at the end of the day, it has to be something that's decided by the people themselves, and the society in question. And there's always going to be a trade-off, and there are always going to be people who don't agree with it.
Absolutely love what you say. And I must say, after having spent 8 years living in Singapore, I deeply valued the stability of the societal context, which, as you look around the world today, is certainly not present in so many countries. And that draws us to a really important point. In business, we have 2 licenses to operate. We have a legal and regulatory license to operate, which we've just talked about. But we also have a social license to grow and innovate. And Sunita, I'm going to land these questions at your doorstep because you represent many of the challenges of the guys who are deemed too big to fail. Tell us, in this age of a friction-free economy, there is a perception that you do need to be socially responsible for the things that occur on your platform, even if you are legally and regulatory within the rights of the law. And there is a letter of the law, as Yusarn would tell me, and there is a spirit of the law. But there's also a social license. Tell me, what do you see as some of the stickiest points in this current landscape around big tech that big corporations are now having to contend with? We've seen Facebook sitting in front of mass jurisdictions having to attest to the security or to the responsibility of their platforms. We've seen the same with Amazon in terms of anti-competition. What do you see as the most important points that we should take out of these?
Okay, there's a lot there. I think one of the things that's really important when we have these conversations about technology is that we have like a lot of conceptual clarity about what we're talking about, because I think we took technology out of the equation. And if we were having a conversation about misinformation in the offline world, or if we were having a conversation about how we protect children, or if we were having a conversation about competition, or if we were having a conversation about taxation, they would be kind of a separate panel, I suppose. And so one of the things that I often see in this area is that because these things have a uniform layer right now, that their technology, they often get conflated. And so I think this is something that I think is really important as we sort of talk about these issues. So sometimes I get asked questions like this and I'm like, whoa, where do I start? Because I could talk to you for an hour about online safety. I could talk to you for an hour about misinformation. So I think that I'll try to make a few high level points. I think what Yusarn said earlier around these are not new problems is a really important thing. So one of these many issues that my organisation works on is mis and disinformation. So DIGI is an industry association in Australia. We've actually come up with an Australian code of practice on how how large technology companies, have sort of consistency around addressing mis and disinformation. One of the interesting things about misinformation is it's not a new problem, right? Like if you go back to the French Revolution, there was a step change in technology where suddenly you had printing presses quadrupled, and suddenly you saw all of these anonymous pamphlets distributed in order to undermine the French monarchy. So when there's a step change, what's different is misinformation and people misleading others. That's always existed, right? But what changes, I suppose, the technology is often that scale and spread. So I think we can make this point across a number of areas. I think Yusarn raised the question around, is it futile to regulate technology? I disagree. I think we do need regulation. I think there's also a misconception that this is an unregulated industry. And I think, I often hear, at least in Australia, oh, the internet is the Wild West. It's not. There's a whole raft of legislation that is rapidly being updated. In Australia, we've got, online safety law that's in existence since 2015. It's just recently been updated in 2021. We've got, consumer law. We've got defamation law that's being updated for the online world. We've got a Privacy Act that's being updated. So it's actually not factually correct to say that it's not regulated. So I think that regulation needs to exist. I think it needs to be updated. I also think we need to think about where that layer of regulation is needed in a rapidly digitizing economy. So, for example, questions of privacy are not just restricted to technology companies. They're also related to the trends. If I go scan my credit card or my supermarket loyalty card, I don't know what the passage of data is there. So as the economy digitizes, then we need to look at how these questions that sometimes we narrowly associate with big tech actually apply economy-wide. So I think going back maybe 2 questions ago to like this question of weaponization, I think AI is a really good example here, right? Where sometimes we see governments think, okay, how do we resolve the challenges related with AI and technology? And sometimes there can be a focus on, well, we've got to look at the algorithm. And yeah, you could do that. Or you could actually look at the application of the algorithm, and you could actually then look at, well, where is there discrimination happening in artificial intelligence? And do our anti-discrimination laws need to be updated to address that? So I guess, again, touching upon about 15 different areas, I think at a high level, the point is that we need regulation of technology, but we also need regulation in a whole suite of areas to be updated in light of technology.
Great. And I think you raise a really good point, that key point around the fact that technology is simply the horizontal layer, right? It's really around the issues that we're trying to address pertaining to the use of the technology. And second is talking about the updating of those regulations. And I feel like we're all living on a moving target. Yusarn, you've seen the rapid change in regulation. You've seen the rapid change in privacy laws and the implementation of those, and now the enforcement of those. Tell us, what do you see as the biggest challenges for the small and medium enterprises to adapt to this big friction-free ecosystem that we're living in now? You talked about our inability to compete in the friction-free landscape with the big players. How do we adapt to that? Is that point, going back to Sergey Netazine earlier, of disruption? How do we leverage our technology in those use cases to achieve disruption? Is it enough or is it not? What is it that an SME should be focusing on at this moment?
That's a good question. I think we need to differentiate between 2 types of SMEs. One is the traditional business that's trying to adapt to a new digital world. Their business models may be getting obsolete as a result of digital transformation of the entire economy. And they are trying to catch up. and they need the tools in order to do that. To some extent, I think that's really the easier problem to solve, because you see a lot of government programs to assist these types of businesses. In Singapore, we've seen it, how the the government is trying to encourage the adoption of digital payment and delivery service models for traditional hawker stalls for food, and we also see a lot of funding by the government for adopting digital solutions to different aspects of business. And so this is actually good. I think it's good for the SME companies that need to sort of update themselves, and it's also good for the technology providers who are providing these solutions. I think that the harder problem, and I think it's not an easy problem to solve, is the idea that you have the other group of startups and SMEs that are coming up with digital solutions, but they're going up against the big boys that have a stranglehold on certain. I mean, their platforms themselves that are proprietary are really de facto standards and the de facto platforms for communication, for sharing, for distribution of digital content, and for software, for apps and things like that. And they're able to exact a tax on innovation, basically. But the thing is, I think it's not, these companies are not immune from obsolescence, right? We've seen the technological giants of yesterday becoming the dinosaurs of today, right? And I think there's nothing to prevent someone coming up with a completely new way of doing things that basically make Facebook or Google obsolete. It can happen. So that's one thing. But in the meantime, you also have these very powerful companies. You do nothing about it, right? And so that's where I think the competition law comes in some respects, and also where from the consumer side of things like privacy laws, personal data protection laws also come in. The other part of it is to address vulnerabilities in their systems. So cybersecurity laws are also coming into place. And you see that actually across the spectrum. You see all countries are really looking at that, right? So if you look at China, for example, they have a cybersecurity law. I mean, and much of it is really directed to protecting consumers, right? You see also a crackdown, I think, on the tech sector. And a lot of it, again, is trying to protect the consumer, to prevent these giants from becoming too powerful, right? Of course, you could say, well, it's also to preserve the political power of the government against these tech giants. But at the same time, you can see also that they are also addressing issues like privacy, the improper use of financial information, and things like that. So I think this is a common concern.
And there's a question from the audience in the spirit of that. How does Web 3.0 change regulations made in different countries? Does it?
I don't think so. It's a technology. Yes, it allows you to do a lot more, right? They talk about, and it's a number of different things, actually. Web 3.0 is a convenient label. I think it covers quite a lot of things. It covers things like the blockchain, it covers things like the semantic web, and so forth. Essentially using the internet not just as a passive way of consuming information, but really having a lot more technology that enables the machine to predict human behavior and to adapt to human behavior. I think one way in which you can, I mean, in a dystopian world, 3.0 will be used sort of to regulate every part of your life. Every transaction you do becomes transparent, but that's already happening anyway, right? So I think, again, going back to the Pandora's box, idea that we have to, and again, Sunita, I don't disagree with you that there needs to be regulation that is updated for the technology. It's just that you can't prevent new technology from coming up. I think that was my point, right? It will change the way we have to regulate. And again, the favorite term is technology neutral legislation, right? You have to try and future-proof things. And so again, it goes back to regulation of human behavior. That's that's basically what the law is designed to do. You can't stop people from inventing new machines or new ways of doing things, but you can prevent these things from and you direct it against the ills or the mischief in the old legislative language, right? Of what certain new developments have come up with, and it can be positive. I mean, taking the example that Sunita gave earlier about the printing press, right? The printing press gave rise to the law of copyright, right? And the law of copyright also enabled the creation of industries based around copyright. We wouldn't enjoy music, movies, books, and things like that without the means to protect the ownership of these creations, right? So there is also the positive aspects of things. So it's not regulation of technology, but it's regulation of the new ways that we can behave as human beings and as societies, and rules that need to go around that to make sure that these things exist for the benefit of most people, if not all people.
Wonderful. I love that expression. And here's another question from the audience, Sunita. And I'm living right by the Luxembourg Space Agency. So it's rather a relevant one as we write space law here. Is there a possibility that we'll see a global regulatory authority for Earth and space related regulations as we set up our human colony in Mars? It's taking us above and beyond our traditional society to thinking intergalactically, which of course Richard Branson and indeed Tesla are encouraging us to do.
Well, I'm not sure. I haven't given this one much thought, to be honest. But it's an interesting question. And I think, yeah, it's kind of a question of the future. Like, we have this sort of, one of the big challenges, and I think Yusarn touched upon it earlier, is around interoperability and extraterritoriality. Two very hard words to say, but two very important concepts when we talk about technology policy. As I said at the beginning, I'm very focused on Australia, not Earth and not space, but I guess in Australia, and even seeing this today with sort of another regulatory proposal that's being put out there, there's a real focus on extraterritoriality, and then it means that a sort of Australian, that law actually, some laws will capture kind of companies outside of Australia. How does that work? And so I guess when we think forward, and we're certainly seeing more cooperation with governments, technology policy is kind of an area where there is increasing cooperation between governments about how they approach things. So I think this is a really interesting vantage point from which we should look at this issue. I don't know that I can really offer any insightful comments on space, but I just think that as how all of these things connect, lots of different interesting questions. And I think certainly with technology companies, where they're domiciled, where their users are, I mean, these are all kind of questions that anybody who's worked for a global company grapples with, right? And also I guess thinking about small and large companies, I mean, small companies that have a global presence need to comply with all of the regulations in all of the countries that they operate in. How does one do that as a startup, let alone a scale up, and I've certainly experienced that in my prior role when I worked in, I guess, what you'd consider a scale up that was very much global in nature. You'd have to come up with these sorts of policies and compliance frameworks across so many different jurisdictions in the world. So gone are the days where you can kind of just say, oh, I'm in this country. Like, no, that's not the way it works. So I think these are really, really interesting questions that all companies of all sizes, whether they've got 2 employees or whether they've got tens of thousands, have to really grapple with and resource in varying ways.
And is that really, when we think about the resources that are available to small, medium enterprises, where do you see the resources to enable and support those companies that, are one man in his garage, or, a very small team that is suddenly wanting to move across border because that's where their users are? Where do you see the enablement of an ability to garner an understanding of these laws and regulations? Who should provide that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's actually a gap. I think that there's I don't know, and I can't speak for every country. I mean, I think certainly in Australia, this is, as I sort of mentioned before, this is a heavily is an increasingly regulated space. A good example is, and the way that we often see laws actually written in Australia, and I think the recent Online Safety Act is a good example. It was a very fully share the objective of that law. That law is around sort of removing, extremely harmful content from the internet and incentivizing fast takedowns. However, the way that that's the scope of that law is written is that it covers every single website in Australia. Like if you have a cafe and a website, like that's captured. And so something that the governments need to think about, because where do you draw the line, right? Like should we be focusing on the companies and the services that pose the greatest risk? This is, I think, one of those issues where I don't think that small companies have in my experience, I think companies have to reach a level of maturity to have a public policy or a content policy. That doesn't happen in the early stages. And so I don't think there's a huge amount of support. And I think there's a risk if we don't target the scope of legislation correctly. And I've seen this done better in some markets than others. Like I've seen the UK do a better job of this than Australia in some areas. Then you're going to just have small companies just turn a blind eye and hope for the best.
To be honest, let's think like a startup. They are scrappy, right? They're just flat out getting the minimum viable product to deliver that desired customer experience, let alone think about the myriad of regulations that may be facing them as they go out to deliver that service to the customer. And this really, when we think about competition and we think about providing a level playing field, Yusarn, what do you see as the biggest challenges for these small, medium enterprises to be able to compete? And more importantly, for us to provide that inclusive level playing field?
Wow, that's I think that's a big question, and I think the answers will be different in different industries. Let me just deal with the financial industry, right? I think that's where a lot of the smaller companies come up against the very traditional institutions, right? And come up against laws and regulations that are actually designed to regulate those very traditional but well-resourced institutions, which the fintech is not equipped to sort of deal with, right? And one of the examples would be the technology risk management guidelines that are issued by MAS, and they require certain types of financial institutions, right, to be able to ensure that they have proper protection of sensitive financial data and so forth, right, and that they are able to prevent people from hacking and getting all that information. And this is difficult for some the smaller fintechs, right, and they find that they are subject to the same rules and regulations, and these might be actually even challenging for banks to comply with, right? And they have entire departments doing it. So I think here's something which I think selective application of these rules and providing, I think, regulatory sandboxes might be helpful to enable these companies to sort of grow and do their MVP and to sort of scale to a certain level where then they start to affect a bigger group of the public, the consumers, and therefore need to come under some kind of regulation. I think that a one-size-fits-all kind of regulatory framework is also increasingly going to be difficult to apply across the board for all, for the entire industry. And I think this is already something that's recognized by the MAS, for example. They have different rules for different license holders. Basically, looking at the risk-based aspects of things. But the risk, of course, could be a very large risk, even if the company is small, right? Particularly if they scale really, really fast and they become, a very popular solution. And then people discover, as a lot of the cryptocurrency exchanges, for example, discover that their security is not as good as they thought it was. And that really then provokes, again, a public reaction and then a call for further regulation, right? So I think right-sizing the regulation is important, but just as important is really providing very clear rules that's easily accessible I think MAS does a good job of it. It's published. You can find the guidelines and regulations on the internet very easily. The other aspect of it is the ability to comply. There's no point making a law that nobody knows how to comply with, right? And much of, I think, the compliance these days are going to, again, be, with the help of technology, right? The entire area of RegTech, for example, exists for that purpose, right? So I think it's going to be a mix of different solutions.
Yeah, I love what you said about right-sizing regulation. I think as I land all of these fintechs from Australia into the Singapore FinTech Festival, that is the one topic on everybody's mind, is how am I going to operate in this market and do it without breaking the law? And I think the second thing that you raise is this opportunity for sandboxing to allow startups to build and thrive before having to face. And then the third one is ensuring those clear rules are easily accessible. They're excellent points. Now, there's another wonderful question from our audience. How can we regulate the future shock that comes with every new technology, inspired by the book Future Shock, written back in the 1970s by Alvin Toffler? Have you got any views on this, Sunita?
Yeah, I can give this a go. I haven't read the book. I think this is an excellent question, right? Because, and I think, and thank you for clarifying that point, Yusarn. I think that's absolutely right, around how, technology moves quickly, that their regulations can be a blunt instrument, because let's be honest, shifting regulation can often be like turning a battleship. I mean, law reform processes take a long time when done properly. So I think one of the key aspects here that we need to strive for in terms of future proofing is around increasing the collaboration between industry and government. And I don't just mean that in a sort of aspirational, because you hear that a lot. What does that actually mean? It means having practitioners in the room. I actually recently learned about this organization. I met with them recently. They're the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, and they've actually created this organization for trust and safety people to have sort of more of a voice in policy. And I thought, gosh, this is important, because in my past life, when I worked sort of more in content moderation, there is a unique set of experiences that as a trust and safety practitioner, as somebody who's looking in at the content compliance, at the contents that you bring. So having those people, having the public policy people, having the legal people in the room, I think a level of co-design is incredibly important around, so we don't just build this point in time regulation that is outdated by the time it's released. I think the other point I would say here is I think there's an opportunity here for, in Australia, there's a big focus on self-regulation and co-regulation, where effectively what this means is that industry comes up with a set of rules. And so I think I raised briefly before the example of the Australian Code of Practice on dis and misinformation. So actually, Yusarn mentioned there's a law in Singapore, around, so Singapore's taken an approach of let's have regulation on misinformation. Australia has taken the approach of let's have industry develop a code of practice for how they'll address that. And so that was something that was put out there, and my organisation DIGI said, okay, let's do this. And so we came up with a code of practice. We launched it with 8 major technology companies earlier this year. And I think this is an example of an area, while there's some areas where I think regulation is really important, this is an example, to the point of the question around sort of future proofing, where disinformation is actually something that's rapidly evolving. So you can hire a firm that specializes in disinformation, or these are really sophisticated state-based actors that are sitting there constantly innovating, and they're closely examining what the major technology companies are doing, and they're updating their technology to evade those responses. Now, if you had a regulatory response here, which prescribed a certain set of measures that companies had to adapt, well, it would fast be out of date. So that's where kind of having a self-regulatory model, which can be sort of more rapidly updated, that's an example where, that's actually really, really effective. So yeah, look, I think it is around kind of that level of co-design on regulation, and also kind of giving up, industry practitioners an opportunity to present something that they think might work to solve, a really complex problem.
Yeah, I love that. I love that concept of co-design of regulation. We've seen so many regulations be put in place that also don't represent the generations, the gender, or the culture right? So having that co-regulation design is so important. I'm just going to bring this back to the issue of privacy. That concept of that being the price to pay to use the service. Tell me, what should we be concerned about here, Yusarn? We've seen very strict regulations be enforced in Singapore and Germany and Japan and other locations around the world pre-GDPR. We're now living in an era of GDPR. And now we're seeing the enforcement actions that sit around that and the enormous fines that any organization can be subjected to. What should be our priorities?
I think there are two ways to look at it. One is the regulatory side, where the governments are putting in place rules that protect consumers, regular people from having their information used in a way that they didn't consent to, right? And I think that's one part of the equation. I think that trend will continue. I think GDPR has sort of set kind of high benchmark for every other country to kind of to some extent reach up to. And I think the rules around processing of data that data of individuals that reside in the EU, if you do business with them, you have to follow those rules, right? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, which in my view is a little bit more interesting, is the idea that individuals should be able to control how their data should be accessed and used, and should have a way to kind of monetize that. So instead of them being so-called the product, because the service is free, and basically the product that they provide is their personal data, the individual can decide how that information can be accessed and used, and be compensated directly for it. And that is the way to kind of use the market mechanism to move the market power towards the consumer, except rather than to just rely on heavy enforcement of the rules by governments.
And we've seen that tokenization of our data in order to give the wealth or the utility back to the user. I work deeply in the healthcare context in Shanghai on senior care in the context of giving seniors the ownership and the monetization of their data. But we've seen the challenges around the execution of that. How do you see us getting to widespread adoption of such models, and what are the limitations?
I think the technology is still new. And sometimes it's also not a question of having a powerful enough technological platform to do it. I think you have to have some improvements, certainly, in relation to how blockchains are being verified, moving away from the proof of work type models, which are very energy intensive, to some other more efficient models. That's one aspect of it. But I think a lot of it is also about educating the public. I mean, you talk about the putting the power back into the consumer's hand, but if you're dealing with an elderly population that's not so tech savvy, how do you deliver it to them in a way that is easy to use, and where the technology really is invisible and people are able to kind of interface with that technology in a kind of more human way, in a way that we can understand. So I think the technology is available, but the question is, it is still about building off that platform, building off the user experience that makes it easier for people to actually take advantage of it. That is where I think it's going to take the most time.
Great points. And Sunita, just wrapping up the panel now, what do you think are the 3 key things that we should be taking out of this panel in the context of big corporations and big data?
Oh God! And what with 60 seconds to spare, 3 big things. Look, I think. Well, I mean, there's a lot here, right? I think there's a couple of take-home lessons here that these are all sort of distinct policy issues, and we shouldn't actually just address them all because they have a technology element. We should sort of look forward in the future. We should think about how we get there, and I think that's around close collaboration with industry. And we should sort of think about some of these challenges, such as big data, in the context of the fact that it is harder and harder to draw the line around what is a technology company from the rest of the economy, right? And so we should resist the temptation to sort of look at a lot of these issues as issues that address big technology companies only. And I think that's the way that they're often characterized publicly and by governments, and to sort of look at them as things that affect small companies, scale ups, but also every other company across the economy that's trying to digitize.
And do you think that's fair, Yusarn? Can we truly take the same lens and look at the industry like that, or do we need a different approach?
I find it sometimes difficult to look at the crystal ball and say this is the way it should be, or I think that there will be different approaches, and we'll pretty much have to experiment with it to see what works, right? I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, I think, is about how small companies can work with large companies, and how large companies should provide sort of a good environment for small companies to work with them. Because as you grow in size, you lose that innovative edge, and you really want to push everything along your platform, and you would sort of twist ideas around what makes sense from a quarterly financial statement basis, as opposed to the real innovators out there. And I think there's a role for everyone to play. I mean, the large companies are really good at distribution. They have the channels, they have the users, right? And small companies can really benefit from that. But at the same time, they can really benefit also from the innovation, the completely new way of looking at things, and look at these startups, and basically, yes, they might be the giant killer that could kill your company, but at the same time, they could also offer an opportunity to work together to create that value. And I think I don't have time to talk about the concept of value creation versus value capture, and the temptation for the large company to really just focus on value capture, as opposed to giving enough room for the idea to grow. So yeah, but I think I would always look at it. I mean, it might be strange for a lawyer to say, yeah, regulation, what's really more important is what happens in the marketplace. And I think what is really interesting is how the kind of rules that evolve in the marketplace, as in through contracts, through the way that this is a decent way to transact, and this is a way that ensures longevity because it encourages innovation and encourages value creation and value capture from that activity.
Excellent. And just to sum up, we've covered so many topics here today. We've covered the topics of privacy, data privacy, and the different concerns of consumers around how their data should be managed and how users should have their data used. We've talked about misinformation. We've talked about the context of online safety. We've also talked about how we see the digital opportunity, that interplay of one industry or another, that pivot to digital transformation for traditional businesses, and that opportunity to contribute everyone to the digital economy, even if we are locked in our homes. And finally, just to share this context of right-sizing regulation, making clearly available rules easily accessible to all, and delivering sandboxes so that we can open, innovate together and deliver value creation. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated the conversation, particularly in the light of our ambitions, which is, of course, exporting Australian fintechs into the coming Singapore FinTech Festival. You've highlighted a great number of opportunities for them to consider, and certainly have given them thoughts to ponder when it comes to the risk landscape. Much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again at General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Sunita. Thanks, Yusarn.